We have an interesting panel today in that we're lucky to have Christian Fassot here with us. Christian has a long experience in pharma R&D and pharma development generally, and he is the VP Medical Affairs at Sanofi in France. My role, I'm listed here as co-chairman of TTS Limited, which is a company where I'm partners with Morris. So Morris is also co-chairman of TTS Limited. But my other job in consulting is working with biotech companies and universities in raising venture capital and doing business development deals. And that's my organization, Valor Management. Morris is also managing director of Tech Investor in the UK. And I'll ask Morris to present that. And then we have Mohammed Yahya, who is the editor of Nature Middle East, and he's based here in Egypt. Can I ask each of you to just, starting with Mohammed, to give us a brief background, 1 or 2 minutes on your own background and your perspective before we get into the issues?
Oh, right there, okay. Right, okay, my name is Mohammed Yahya. I'm the editor of Nature Middle East, which is a publication, online publication from the publishers of Nature, the journal. And it focuses on research in this region of the world, in the Arab states mainly. And yeah, this is what I've been doing for the past year and a half or so. We focus on science news, science features, so it's basically a coverage for anyone who is interested to know what is the status of science or what is going on in the science community in this area of the world.
So good morning, my name is Christian Fassot. I'm a medic by training and with specialization in pharmaceutical medicine. So I've been working in pharmaceutical industry for 25 years, something like that now, holding different positions both at national level and international level, and for the last 5 years I'm in charge of the scientific affairs and the R&D for what we call intercontinental, which means basically all of the world except US and Japan and China, I would say. So focusing mainly on what some called emerging countries and what I prefer to call fast-growing countries.
Thank you, Christian. Morris?
Good morning to you all. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for having us here. It's the second time I've been to BioVisionAlexandria, and I very much enjoy it. And I think it's very much a unique conference event, certainly that I've been to. I think it does try to make a difference, so I hope that we can impart some knowledge and indeed experience that might enable you to move forward in the right way with your dissemination of science and propagation of research and innovation. My background is that I was an academic, PhD, fellow. I then went into publishing. I actually really went into online publishing first of all, was the director of a patent database which became what is now Thomson Reuters Pharma. It was called the Investigation Drug Database, so I have understanding of the patenting issues. I then was at Nature, where I was head of strategy and business development for a couple of years. I then became CEO of a biotech investment group. I started up another company which would have been doing rather well had we not had the world economic crash. So that company, Tech Investor, is basically involved in advising biotech companies, universities, regions, and involved in capital raising, which is pretty hard at the moment because money is very hard to come by. And finally, I'm a Chelsea supporter, so I'm delighted that we knocked out Barcelona yesterday for all those football fans. Thank you very much for that. So I will talk shortly.
And I live in Barcelona, but I have nothing against Chelsea. So Morris and I can still work together quite nicely. Before I get started, I'll just outline how this session will work. We are going to do some presentations, but we'll try to take up no more than half of the time we have with the presentations. We would really like to have an interactive discussion. We hope you'll all be involved in that part of it. If you're not, we can argue amongst ourselves, and hopefully that will be useful. But I'm sure from what I've seen in past years, this is my third time here, that we will expect an interactive session with some good debate and discussion, and I look forward to that. I'll speak first, and then Christian will give us a very different perspective, and then Morris will speak. We're going to try to look at innovation in biotechnology from our own perspectives. And the focus, the title that I've used here is Changing Paradigms, Lessons Learned. And I think the lessons learned is a good one, because there's a real resistance in our sector, not on the scientific side, but on the business side and the policy side. There seems to be a real resistance to learning from the mistakes of others. People like to make their own mistakes, unfortunately. And opportunities for emerging bioregions, and there are many. So Valor Management, briefly, we focused on venture and expansion financing, business development and licensing with biotech companies, universities, regions, and associations. The focus is Europe, North America, and the BRICS primarily, and that's all I'll talk about our company. I think what's important to discuss, and we're going to dismiss this as well, but it's important to understand when people talk about biotech and innovation, they're very often talking about something called the classical biotech venture capital model, or VC model. And this is something where there's a lot of talk about there's a shortage of venture capital, there's a shortage of funds, there's a shortage of investors. Before we discuss that, it's important to understand briefly what they are. VCs are not investing their own money. They raise funds from limited partners, or LPs, by proposing to generate returns through making good investments, smart investments in the biotech sector, which they're meant to understand very, very well, and following a specific investment strategy. So they try to pick winners amongst the projects, not just on good science, but on the business model and the potential, and then to help those companies develop. And they want to finance them through the proof of concept. And then traditionally, the exit would be via IPO, which is an initial public offering on a stock exchange. Almost the past decade, but certainly the past 4 or 5 years, it's been much more likely that if they have an exit at all, it's through some sort of deal with industry. And if we talk about pharma, it's some sort of acquisition or partnership or collaboration with big pharma, a trade sale or a licensing. And occasionally there are companies bringing products or services directly to the market. So the VCs make money by charging a management fee on the total amount invested, which is about 2%. It can be 1, it can be 3, depends on where they are, to cover their basic operations. And their real money comes from the IRR, which is the internal rate of return, which is a specific calculation on the return on investment they pay to their own investors. So they make their real money, theoretically, if they are very successful in investing the money that's been given to them for that purpose. And I'll come back to that. So that's where they make their financial upside. Venture capital is relatively high risk, not because they want to be high risk, but because venture capital is a high risk sector, but if it's done well, the returns, as you've seen with company valuations, can be enormous. So that's the classical VC model, which we tend to refer to, but there's a dirty little secret in biotech VC, and that is that generally speaking, venture capital funds have not provided good returns to their investors, or attractive returns, in particular when we compare them to other investment sectors. So as scientists, as researchers, and as entrepreneurs, when you're developing projects, it's important to bear that in mind. The VCs are very skeptical because generally they haven't done all that well with their investments. Some have done very well, but many of them have provided disappointing returns to their limited partners, and they've made little, if any, carried interest. Some have generated real losses for their investors. They've simply lost most of the money that was invested. So the universe of traditional limited partners, those that invest in the VC funds, is shrinking. The big public pension funds in many countries, insurance companies, are investing less and less in venture capital funds. So there's a declining pool of money, and in fact there are fewer VCs around the world, whether we look at Europe or the US. In fact, in Europe, the average return over the past 15 years of venture capital funds has been minus 2% per year. That's the financial, they've lost 2% of the money they've invested per year. They haven't made money. Some funds have done very, very well, but you can count those on two hands. In the US, the rate is a little better. It's about a 15% positive return, but that hasn't competed all that well with other types of investments. So the reality is only an elite few venture capital funds have consistently generated attractive returns for their investors, and they've carried the entire industry as a whole by bringing the rate of return up to that figure, which, as you can see, losing 2% a year is not a very attractive investment. So you can guess that only the most successful funds are going to be able to survive. There are many VC funds out there in Europe, the US, and Asia, which are basically the walking dead. They're still there managing their past investments, but they'll never be able to raise a new fund because their investors will not give them more money. The best VCs are adapting. Some are trying to continue as before, but the leading ones have realized that their model has not been working. They're developing new strategies and models, and they're implementing new collaborations, and we'll talk about those. And I think the important note here is the paradigm itself is changing, and so is the pharma model, and our other speakers will talk about that. So what does this mean for Egypt? What does this mean for fast developing and emerging bioregions around the world? There are some new trends in financing innovation in biotechnology. First of all, there's been increases in public funding generally in the US and in Europe, not just for fundamental blue sky research, which is extremely important, but also for research and development, and specifically development in the case of Europe up through small phase 2 trials for pharma and demonstration projects in industrial biotechnology and other areas. There's a focus on the PPP, 3P, public-private partnerships, which you've heard discussed in other sessions. And VCs are generally insisting on lean, cash-efficient, and semi-virtual companies. They're not building up 30, 40, 50-person companies in the early days. They're building core teams of 3 to 5 people who may be working part-time until they really have the science in place, they really have a functioning business model, and then they can try to scale it up, if they don't just sell the company to a larger corporation. Risk sharing is becoming key. On the pharma side, CROs are much more willing to invest in the programs they're developing. These are contract research organizations. Some of these in countries like India and China are being very active, not just in selling services, but in funding those services themselves and paying half of it for royalties or a percentage ownership in the program, which can greatly decrease the costs for a company or for a startup. So I think the new model, which a lot of entrepreneurs and investors are insisting on, is that you don't get an upside. Nobody's guaranteed to make money unless they're going to share the risk. Risk management and cash management is a major issue in biotech. There's also new funds which focus specifically not on financing companies, but specific projects and corporate venture, and I think Morris will talk more about this in his session, so I'll skip this here. In terms of Egypt or other emerging bioregions, what are the strategies? What are the advantages of the Egyptian biotech sector? There are probably more, but from an outsider's perspective, a few. I've written good science, and I put a question mark, because coming here every few years, we see a lot of good science, but you're in a better place than I am positioned to say how representative of that, what is the level of science across Egypt. I'm quite willing to assume that it's a high level of science. We see this many places, and that's generally not the problem. It will need reinforcement and funding and new programs, but I'm willing to assume that that base is there. Okay, well, we can come back to that in the we'll come to that in the discussion, but that's well noted. Other advantages, geography, which I don't need to explain, but the position between Africa, the Middle East, Europe. Demographics. It's a challenge, but it's also an upside when we're talking about developing a skilled workforce in high technology areas. And something else I'd like to mention, and I'll come back to this, global network of Egyptians in research and industry. I know Egyptian professors inside the Arctic Circle, and in California and in Asia. There is a broad network of Egyptians around the world, and this can be leveraged. More importantly, though, what are the key challenges, and how can these be addressed? The first And I don't need to know the details, but this is true most places in the world, is an absence of the right innovation ecosystem. And the steps here are to benchmark and implement the best practices and learn from the mistakes of others. And we'll discuss these. Morris will raise some, I'll raise some. One thing we see quite often is people refer to an established bioregion and say, we want to follow the process they used. But they don't stop to realize that those bioregions made enormous mistakes, wasted hundreds of millions of dollars, and you might as well learn from that lesson before replicating it. And we've seen that within Europe. Bioregions have replicated mistakes that if they simply talked to the other bioregion, they would have heard, oh, this was a disaster, we never should have done that. There are policies where we can talk about the smartest investors in Europe, where government policies in their own minds basically paid them to be stupid. Let me give you an example. The government said, we want to encourage more investment in biotechnology. So they said to the investors, invest in companies in any of these technology areas, and if you succeed, great, you make your returns. If your investment fails, we guarantee it. Now, if you stop and think about that, that's essentially telling people, go out and buy as many lottery tickets as you want. If you happen to win, keep the winnings. If you lose, we'll pay you back. So the VCs stopped doing their job. They stopped evaluating the risk. They stopped trying to pick the winners. Anything that looked interesting, they put their money in. Those returns were a lot lower than the returns on other funds. Insufficient public money, public funding. I'll put a question mark there because there are a lot of programs in Europe, in the NIH. I've heard about programs here in Egypt. There are other sources of funding. If we look to the Gulf states, if we look to leveraging investment from other fast-growing countries like the BRICS. One I've highlighted here is lack of TTOs, by which I mean technology transfer officers with real experience and track records. Entrepreneurs do not necessarily need to be business people, but they need to have support around them. Researchers, pardon me, don't necessarily need to be business people, but they need to have support around them with people with industry expertise who understand intellectual property, who can help them manage these issues. And we'll come back to that. And a key step there would be strategic collaborations with leading TTOs around the world who are willing to implement these collaborations and implement secondments and exchanges and help develop the expertise locally, but in the meantime, provide services. And they're not always looking to sell these. Sometimes they just want to be part of the process in technology areas where they have real specialization. So I think there are real opportunities there. Absence of leading biotech VCs with a proven multi-fund track record. This is a real challenge. If you want to develop a bioregion with entrepreneurs and companies, you need to have investors. But this is again is where we need to learn from mistakes, because many efforts to start up a venture capital fund in different bioregions around the world have really yielded some pretty lousy venture capital funds, which have not helped. So how do we do this? One, instead of just giving the money away, incentivize angel investors. These are business people, wealthy individuals. Incentivize them either through tax incentives or other to reinvest their money in biotechnology and life sciences and high growth areas that are important for the future of the country. There are some excellent models right now. There are examples in France, believe it or not, the best current examples which are leading to these new project finance companies. Funds are in England right now, but this is a known mechanism that can be implemented in many ways. And then establish a regional fund, but do this very carefully. The model I would not want to see is where the government says, here's $100 million, and here are a couple of bankers and scientists from academia, and they're going to invest this money. It's been done a lot, and it's never worked anywhere. It just hasn't. It can work when you're talking about hundreds of billions of euros and you're looking at a 25-year plan, like in a place like Singapore or in a place like China where you've got essentially bottomless pools of money. But in terms of a fund having a concrete output, it just doesn't work that way. You need professional investors, biotech investors who know what they're doing. They need to use professional standards. With incentivization, they make money when they succeed. They make a living in the meantime, but they make real money and potentially become wealthy only if they succeed for the government, for the region, for their companies, for their investors. They need to be independent and they need to be transparent and follow international norms. One, because you get better results. Two, because you just can't do business with international investors and pharma companies if you don't follow these standards. It's just like the science. If you don't do the science to the right standards, you can't work with major industry. There's a financial side to that as well. Links to international capital for follow-on investment rounds. So what you see in China quite often is they attract international funds to come and work in China. They invest and the Chinese invest, and they put their people in with the people who have 30 years experience, and they work together for 5 to 10 years and develop more expertise. That works. And links to industry, who are at the end of the day the customers. Shortage of successful serial biotech entrepreneurs. These are usually researchers who decide they want to go into business. Most world-class researchers don't also make world-class business people, but some do it very well. I suggested recruit here. There was a model used in the 80s in one of the things the Quebec bioregion did very well, which was called Friends of Quebec. They went around the US and around the world and found Quebecers who were in the biotech industry and in finance and in research around the world, and they said, come back to Quebec, and if you can't come back, at least help us, support us with what we're doing, help us train people, take interns. Worked very well. Egypt can do the same with this network of Egyptians in key positions around the world. There are more than you think if you stop, and if the government and the institutions here in the library make a consistent effort to engage them and ask for their support on the business side, that will work. We can discuss this later. So, opportunities for Egypt. Don't follow the usual trend, and unfortunately it's usual in terms of bioregions, of emulating bad policies along with good policies. Try to pick the ones that worked and talk to the regions and ask them which ones worked, which ones do you not recommend. They're generally pretty open about this, although it's not in their presentations because they don't want to highlight it. The right innovation ecosystem is crucial, including stability, intellectual property rights, human capital, and reward for innovation. Focus on weaknesses, not just strengths. And biotech is global. You don't necessarily need to do everything in Egypt. You don't need to use Egyptian mice. It doesn't matter where some of the work is done, as long as the end result is building something that contributes to an Egyptian biotech sector or in any bioregion. Benchmark, but customize strategies. Just because it works in Boston doesn't mean it's going to work the same way here, but you can learn a lot from Boston. You can probably learn a lot more from another region which doesn't have all the natural advantages that Boston has or the Bay Area has, but have built something anyway. Prioritize management talent in addition to research. Not instead of, but in addition. It's not the same thing. Recruit, leverage expats, build alliances, work with serial entrepreneurs and technology transfer organizations worldwide and other stakeholders. And tech transfer, I think, is key. This is something where you can have a significant impact relatively quickly in a 5 to 10 year scheme by implementing best practices and working with the leading institutions worldwide. Collaborating now, not just on advice, but let's work together. Can you help us on our projects? Can you work with our offices? And do that through exchanges, secondments, internships, and ongoing collaborations in given technology areas. Incentivize entrepreneurship, encourage people to take risks and develop business models, and angel investing. And again, if there are efforts to launch venture funds, follow best practices, recruit top talent. It doesn't matter who they know, doesn't matter what their position is, it matters what their background and what their proven capacity is. And continuous engagement and dialogue between all stakeholders and policymakers. There's something quite interesting in Europe the past 3 years. They've had a conference which we helped put together and sort of getting the key stakeholders from finance and industry and patients organizations involved. And they really look at what European policy is in terms of developing. I mean, they've been funding through 7 framework programs of 5 to 7 years each now. They've been funding research for a long time, but it's only 4 years ago that they said, we really need to evaluate where this is going, and are we funding the right things, and what are the real challenges that we should be addressing? Maybe we're ignoring the most important things, not by intention, just because we don't realize where the obstacles are. So let's get the stakeholders in, have them tell us what's working, and what are the problems, and what should we focus on. This is something which Egypt is in a perfect position to start doing right now with the students, with the researchers, with the local business people, with the international expats, with entrepreneurs, get them all engaged. And I do want to get next to Christian because I've taken a little bit too long, but we are going to save 30 minutes for discussion at the end of all of this, and I'm looking forward to your point. So that's the presentation. I just would like to highlight, as I mentioned, Morris and I are partners. We work with a number of key institutions around the world on technology transfer, putting together universities with industry and helping train the technology transfer officers and having the industry people help train them. If any of you are interested, come and talk to us. We'll see if we can help arrange for you to participate either in Europe or in the United States at the summits this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for this introduction, I think, on the challenges and lesson learned already. And I think that in my presentation, I'll try to address the point of view of, let's say, R&D in the pharma world in general, not focusing on biotechnologies, but I have no doubt that we can bridge both this presentation during the discussion. So innovation, ladies and gentlemen, innovation in R&D is clearly a very broad topic. So I intend today to go through this content, looking at well, what went wrong really in R&D, because we haven't been successful. I'm not talking only about pharmaceutical industry. So we have also some key learnings, but also questions to address. Also some piece of reflection in order to reinvent the R&D model, focusing on the pillars, the drivers, and the guiding principle, and hopefully some hopeful vision for the future. So the worst of time in R&D, perhaps, probably, yes, a lot of issues in R&D nowadays, the patent cliff, insufficient new molecules in the pipeline, so costs that are really skyrocketing, decreasing in the number of new chemical and new molecular entities that are discovered and put on the market to the benefit of the patient, budget pressures, both at the public side and at private side within the pharmaceutical companies, longer development times and costs due partly to the difficulties but also to new regulations, shorter patent protection, and a lower success rate in the industry. We are moving from 1 to 8 success rate to 1 to 14 today. Also a changing perception of what is really the incremental medical value of what the pharma industry and the researchers are bringing really to the patients. And in R&D, Sid Brenner say we have had a low input, a very high throughput, but no input at all at the end. So this is the challenges. Those are the challenges we have to address. And so where are we today? Well, today the situation is as follows. You see that in order to launch one single molecule on the market, you need the different stages of the clinical development and preclinical development, several molecules. So you need today around 25 to 30, let's say, projects in drug discovery in order to exit at the end after many years with only one molecule. And the attrition you have at the different phases is clearly due to different topics. You have some here, non-validated targets, more focus on molecular biology that really on the signification, on the translation of what it means in clinical practice, wrong choices in management, etc., etc. But this is the situation. And the core issue is really a drastic drop, spectacular drop in R&D productivity. You have on the left the clinical timelines increasing, so the development time let's say, necessary to conduct all the clinical phases of the program have doubled in 10 years, 15 years. The number of molecules in the middle, new chemical entities and new biological entities that were approved by main regulatory bodies has drastically decreased, and you have the number there. And again, the cost of R&D have been exponentially increasing with time. So those are the issues. So the question is really from there, this is the status, but what went wrong really with this model? So probably the innovation model was not right. There are some believes that advances in basic sciences could be easily translated to human diseases, but we know now that this is not the case. We have had, and we have been tackling much too many novel targets, but we have been tackling non-validated targets in humans, so that means that the applicability or the translationality of those findings hasn't been concretized. And we have been, following the path, classical one, a linear one, from discovery to development, and from development to market, with really little interaction between those sequential phases. Also, and this is partly the responsibility of pharmaceutical companies, we have been focusing too much probably on Me Too plus drugs, so a smaller added value to what we are looking at, rather than looking at really some molecules or drugs that really make a difference for the patient and for health, and a strategy on goal. The organizational model also was probably wrong. So pharma companies today, most of them are really large, very complex, very heavy organizations, due basically also to the heritage of successive mergers, so it's not very flexible. Pharma companies have been focusing on internal research rather than really trying to connect outside, and to connect to research centers outside, but also to connect to what is really the medical reality out there in the field and what is really the medical need out there. Structural issues like resource allocations that were driven by functions, that rather really than to focus on projects that were making a difference or potentially making a difference. We were lacking a rigorous and most importantly independent mechanism of review and prioritization. So the project leaders were pushing their own projects, whether or not they were good, and really a true disconnect between the R&D strategies and the rapid changes in the scientific, medical, and market environment. So what changed in the field? What changed in the environment? First of all, the patient needs changed, because we moved from acute diseases to chronic diseases, and this is true in many therapeutic fields, even in oncology, for instance. So the personalized medicine rise there, generics are there. The payers have also changed, the public and the private payers. They want, of course, much more value for money today. We have seen the rise of formularies. We have seen payment restrictions, of course, due to budget issues, and more price control. Regulations have changed. The regulatory burden is important. In Egypt, it takes today more than 3 years, or around 3 years, to get a product registered, and this is also true in many parts of the world. Safety thresholds have been increased, so we have had to face some post-marketing requirements, longer R&D cycles. And last but not least, the science has changed as well. Science has changed because we now know that the predictability of what we are doing in the labs in human is very low. We concentrated probably too much on too few targets, and the low success rates that you have seen and I've tried to explain is certainly a key factor there. So overall, a low efficiency. So from there, what are the key learnings and the questions? But the key learnings are probably that we need to be more self-critic within the pharma industry about what we have been doing and what we are doing, to try to change the choice of indication for the molecules and the compounds we have in order to link them with a true understanding of the biology. We need really a true alignment of the credentialing and the pathways in targeting, in pharmacology with the end product, which is a product for one indication, and to bring the two in connection. We need definitely new ways to design and conduct clinical trials. We need really to also cross-fertilize strategies and programs with external R&D, not only looking at what is going on within the pharma industry, and how to do that has to be defined. We need to better understand the R&D environment, and this is a very competitive environment, also in the emerging or fast-growing countries. And to define what we want to do in terms of standards, because it's easy to tackle, let's say, very big indications. It's a little less evident to tackle a strategy for a high unmet medical needs, but for which you have some very often a low science translational project. So if you have low science but a high medical need, how do you reconcile all this? So if we achieve all this, it will be good already, but clearly this won't be enough. And we need to really reinvent or try to reinvent the R&D model of the future. So, of course, I have no pretension here to say how this model should be reinvented, because nobody knows. The textbook of how to fix really R&D has not been written yet. But a few ideas of food for thought and for your reflections based on 3 pillars, 3 drivers, and some guiding principles. So the pillars are the 3 following ones. Strategic excellence. We have to know where we want to go. If you do not know where you want to go, obviously you won't never reach there. We have to have this strategy. This is one point, but we have to implement it, and to implement it correctly. So this is what we call operational excellence, and what we call emotional excellence. Well, it's all of us. It's people, because there is no research without people. You have been tackling the need of top talents and skilled and seasoned talents, and this is really what also makes the difference. So 3 core strategic drivers of R&D today. The medical value. Yes, we have to position R&D to address the current market drivers for health and medicine. So there needs to be a medical value, and a clear one. And we have to focus on high and growing unmet medical needs in order to have an impact on public health. The operational effectiveness, well, the operating models, the way we are functioning in R&D can certainly be improved. The cycle times can be reduced and should be reduced. We should focus on the projects rather than really transversally. Leadership is important, and the third one, the scientific quality, is of course also very important. So we probably need to move much quicker to fast in human strategy rather than really going sequentially. But of course, to do that, you need to have the credentials I was talking about, and I will come back to that in order to get there. So we have to confirm the disease hypothesis in human as early as possible, and probably reduce the quantity and focus a little more on quality. So if this is the equation basically of R&D productivity. So R&D productivity is a result of the 3 components: medical value, scientific quality, and operational effectiveness. So how to address those drivers and what will result from addressing those drivers is defining really how we will manage the what and the how we do things in R&D. So the what is the target portfolio. What are we looking at? What products? What are our aims. And the how is really how we work in order to get those compounds, portfolio of products into the end of the pipeline. So the R&D strategy refresh is really coming from different sides. It's coming from what you can call a top-down strategic exercise, whether at company management level or at state level or at agency level or at the lab level, and really another one that is coming from the bottom, from the units, from the project leaders, from the researchers, that do define really on one side what are the contributions, what are the opportunities we have, how can we maximize the value of the different projects, how do we arbitrate between the projects, because we cannot run them all. We have some limitations in resources, in budget, in people, etc. And then from the other sides, from the project leaders, from the teams, well, also what are the priorities and what are the risks on my projects and what are the choices I have to make. And so if we do that together and from both sides on what we do, on what can we do and what could we do, then we reach doing so, what should we do? So this is a little bit more funneling on what we really want to do. I won't enter into the details of all these slides, but just tackle a few headings on this strategic reflection or new strategic reflection. We have really to maximize the overall R&D contribution. And in order to do that, in order to really understand the true profitability, not in business, in money terms, but profitability in terms of value of the different projects. We also have to evaluate the existing and new strategic opportunities. So what we are doing, is it right, or is it really already out of date because strategic opportunities elsewhere has been tackled and perhaps our projects are obsolete. Then, of course, yes, you have a global vision. Think global, but we also should act locally. And I would like to focus a little bit here and to crystallize the healthcare priorities on the major economies. And really the national priorities that you can have in all the countries, and they are different from countries, and the ecosystems are also very different, should define really what we do and how we respond together to those needs. So yes, there are a lot of opportunities to synergize what we are doing together, you in your academic and centers and labs and the pharma industry. And this should be done in partnership. And partnership, of course, as you know, is a win-win. So it means winning for everybody. And the articulation of external innovation and policy strategy is, in that perspective, very important because, as you stressed, I think that the right environment should be there in order to really be successful, and you need to have some I would say not necessarily friendly, but clear and transparent environment in order to know what are the rules of the game. So the maximization of the portfolio value, we have sleeping beauties as well, you know, in all the programs that we have, that projects that are less priority today that we do not use for many reasons, but perhaps those projects can be of interest to someone else, to some labo elsewhere, and probably, you know, to recycle what you are not doing anymore and allow someone else to develop it might be a nice way to do that. And the same applies for the late-stage projects that we have also in the pipeline of pharma industries. We have some sleeping beauties, sometimes much later than proof of concept, sometimes even in phase 3, that we put aside for different reasons, except, of course, toxicity and safety, that might be of interest to some parts of the world, even if they are not global. And last but not least, the external innovation is also key. As I try to stress, the identification of innovation activities in the world in general, outside your lab, outside of the pharma, outside of your sphere of working and projects is key. And of course, you need to know what you are looking for. And so you need to have a gap analysis about what are your priorities, what you cannot address yourself, and what you want to partner on. So this external innovation, and as Christian pointed out, also can be improved in terms of how we process this. And again, with the same spirit of partnership rather than mercenaryship, we should deal with targeting, deal with signing, increase the efficiency of what we are doing, and also book some short-term results, because quick wins improve impact and image. So yes, there are probably alternatives and creative and room for creation in partnership models too, and we have to work on this as well together. So the portfolio in all of this will be really prioritized according to the medical value and the translational feasibility, because it's useless to have a good compound but that you cannot really put on the marketplace for different reasons, and the mechanism of action is important, but the measurement of the effect in human body is even more important. I think time is over where you will come on the marketplace with a new chemical entity. It's good to have a new chemical entity. It's always sexy to be first in class, but at the end of the day, what makes the difference is the therapeutic effect on the patient, not the mechanism of action. So the guiding principle, two guiding principles, I think. One is open innovation. I think I've been stressing this point sufficiently. Cooperation is clearly one of the key engines of innovation, and collaboration is internally and externally. I mean, you are thinking, I'm talking about collaboration between pharma industry and labo and biotech industry, etc. Yes, of course, I'm talking about this as well, but I'm also addressing internal collaboration within your academies, between your different labos, or between a labo in Egypt and another one in the Gulf or wherever. So this is what I mean about collaboration. And then translational medicine. So translational research, translational medicine is really merging the science of human disease with the technology of drug development, discovery development, and deployment. So in the past, this is what, and this is also today, what we are still doing. We come from the labo, then we enter into the different phases of clinical development, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, then we have some population research, and then we put the product on the market, and then we have post-approval studies, and this is the way it is today. The way it should be is that one, which really is not sequential at all. It's a way in which laboratory research is directly in phase with clinical trials with the orientation of the patient. Population-based research is really in phase with the labo, and all this is basically a new way to do things. It's a new discipline. And so at the basis of this translational research, translational medicine, there is a need for a clear understanding of the human biology early in research, and this is really the core approach. So as I said, the mechanism of action needs to be understood, of course, and this is a paramount pathway to go through, but the measurement of the effect in human is of utmost importance as well. So the combination of both, you know what your drug is doing, how it is working, and really what it makes, will define the probability of success. And of course, your probability of success is the highest when you know what the drug is doing and you have a high or excellent effect in human. And we should focus on the high there, certainly. So translational medicine is at the core. We need to evidence the mechanism in human diseases, and this is not always the case. We should try to validate as early as possible the pathways and the molecular target. We should have a full understanding of the mode of action. This seems obvious to you, but perhaps I can assure you we have put in the last 20 years many molecules in clinical development for which the mechanism of action was not really truly understood. And this is where the failure is coming, because then you have some drugs, exiting with very nice results in phase 2 and very disappointing phase 3 trials. And of course, this is where the bunch of investment is in phase 3. So you have been investing for nothing. Why? Partly, it's not all of the explanation, it's part of the explanation because the mechanism of action was not understood. So we have to innovate in order to experiment those drugs in human fast and innovate in trial designs. And to be courageous and to stop really the molecules that do not show a clear evidence of translatability in human as well. So from there, some proposal for a vision for the future, and this is the last part of my slides. So we really have to have an aggressive end-to-end management of the portfolio that we have in the labs, in the pharma industry, etc., and focus really on quality rather than quantity. We have to prioritize based really on rigorous scientific and translational medicine principles that I have tried to explain a little bit. We have to focus the resources. Too many resources are lost today because they are spent on wrong projects, and resources are again budget and people, and we have really tried to choose the right high-value projects that are going to make a difference. We have to enter into novel emerging area of sciences, and many you are contributing to. We have to innovate in models to serve external and external innovation and to attract the best talents, the best scientists and also the ideas. And so all of this is, in a way, a new spirit in the R&D and in the pool, in the management of the talent pool. So, I thought that this was illustrative, probably on how thought is to be innovative. It's not easy to be innovative, but allowing the idea, just the idea, not to kill the idea, and to allow the idea to survive is something even thought of. So, in order to conclude, from the worst of time, yes, but perhaps also some bright future, because I believe I'm optimistic and I think that we are entering into the best of times. We are really in an exciting revolutionary period in R&D. There are a lot of opportunities for creativity and inventiveness. We are refocusing on the science, which is basically our job, right, and our patient, though. Focus on the science, but on an applied science, so a science that has its translation to human biology and so doing to human therapies. So it's a complex job that we have, and human diseases are complex as well. So we have to tackle different approaches to solve the complexity of the task that we have in front of us. Open innovation is key, as I try to explain or to propose to you. Excellence in strategy and execution is also paramount. A sense of urgency is probably much needed. There are many medical needs, many unmet medical needs, and those needs to be addressed as soon as possible. And well, I believe, we believe that the future really belongs to those who will be able to reinvent the R&D. And altogether, I think we have an opportunity to not write history, but probably a part of history. So thank you very much.
So we'll have Maurice's presentation, and I'm fairly confident that will get us right into some sort of debate and discussion. Maurice.
Right, good morning. I'm going to come at this from a very different angle. I agree with things they both said, and I particularly disagree with quite a lot of what they both said. The issue here, I think, is the most important, perhaps to a lot of you in the room, is the title. So, fostering innovation in biotechnology. So what I want to really kind of focus on is how we actually define that. I mean, are we financing? We could change that word fostering for a lot of words. Financing, we could actually incorporate it as developing as well. So where I want to come from is looking at it from an emerging nation, not just Egypt, but any, in the sense of where their place is in big pharma, in their development of, or their pursuit of development of drugs and medical technologies and healthcare products, and even the financial side as well. So when I talk about a bedrock, nothing is going to happen. Absolutely nothing is going to happen unless you have a solid foundation from which to build your science. Nothing. Big pharma are not going to be interested. Venture capitalists aren't going to come in. It won't sustain. So what I'm talking about is from the public perspective of funding in biotechnology. Now, fostering, funding, going back to what I'm saying, what I'm talking about here is that public money really starts the whole process, because without public money, academic research does not happen. Without academic research, you cannot, in the world of biotechnology, do this on your own. You simply can't. It's not possible. Just the analyses alone that you're required to do to prove your results, you need an academic institution, you need the facilities there. So, in terms of biotechnology and what we're talking about and the evolution to get to something that is good, equitable for development in a commercial context, you need to have a bedrock. How are we going to do that? Well, we've kind of heard it in another session, so I'm not going to go over it for too long, and Christian mentioned it as well. Really, very simply, you need to invest in your people, your population. That is the most important thing of, I think, public funding, providing the bedrock and also investing in the people. Now, I've seen a couple of things, and I've mentioned it, or I've not mentioned it, but I think you've got relationships with the EU. I was in a session yesterday, and DAD, and these are good programs, and a lot of people are saying there should be more. No, fundamentally, it should only be allocated according to quality. There's no point in throwing money at people who either can't do the research or can't translate that research into a tangible result of benefit for the community in return to the public funding that was put in, or the fostering of that innovation. So what you also need to do is, I think, is encourage, as Christian mentioned, encourage those Egyptians or those people who are from the country concerned to return. You have to give them the facilities in order to create a research centre of excellence. You have to enable that. And then I would also add that one of the most important things is you have to offer sabbaticals, or you have to get people who are experts and that you want to grow and collaborate with. And I'll keep coming back to this word collaboration because it's probably the most important. You have to collaborate with them. You have to learn from their experience and grow your own. And what I'm trying to get here is that at the moment, what I saw yesterday is you're funding people to go and study PhDs abroad. Wouldn't it be nice whereby you were teaching the PhDs and MSCs here in Egypt, for example, and actually then using that funding to send people away to do postdoctoral research, which is even more profound and further down the line in learning experience. So then you bring these people back. So that's what I'm saying in terms of kind of trying to, develop a bedrock. And I think that's very important, because I think it's very important for the likes of larger, further downstream entities such as venture capital and pharmaceutical industries to become interested and support your research. So what are the pitfalls? Very quickly, you know, obviously, public, Christian hit on it briefly. I'm not going to dwell on it for too long. But, you know, those allocating the funding, those public people within in public service, everybody makes mistakes. I'm not blaming, I'm not appropriating blame in any way, but the allocation of that funding is very important, and also the pertinent allocation of that funding. So it's hard to reject somebody who believes in their science, but it will happen. You have to keep trying, you may have to adapt. But the point is, you have to have a very, very rigid structure to ensure that you're not throwing good money after bad, as an expression, i.e. you fund the right research. Now, the other thing I'd like to make very quickly there, it is very important that we don't just fund research that can only be applied in a commercial aspect. That's not what I think public funding, and I'm in the book somewhere 2 years ago I was actually saying this. I believe very, very strongly that government funding must be maintained funding, so-called, as Christian said, blue sky research, as we all know it is, because that is really where true innovation comes out of, because you don't know what you're trying to do as a scientist until actually you've got the result and then you see a potential maybe for its development from that initial eureka moment. So obviously failure the pitfalls of building, fostering this innovation in biotechnology in a region like this, you know, failures are obvious. If you don't manage to attract back, in this case, so I apologise to people from different nationalities, but if you don't attract back Egyptians to Egypt, if you don't attract foreign leading stakeholders, academics, to come in and impart their knowledge and expertise, if you don't create this critical mass of intellectual innovation, then you're going to have a problem trying to create a scenario whereby you're going to be able to transport that, or these guys are going to transport it. And when I say these guys, I'm talking about the pharma industry and the venture capital industry and the latter stages of the industry of biotechnology. So again, remember that title, Fostering Innovation in Biotechnology. So we're talking about biotechnology. So Christian mentioned it. I'm going to briefly point this out. So, you know, kind of the US and Europe are often held up as examples of having got it right. Well, the US certainly, in my opinion, my humble opinion, I'm a very big fan of what the NIH do, the National Institute of Health in the States. The EU are trying. They are succeeding in some ways, but in other ways they're not. I'll give you an example of what I mean here in the allocation of funding. Germany didn't really have a biotechnology industry 15 years ago, at the end of the 90s. It didn't. It created about 400 companies. This data is from about 2003, 2004. It created 400 companies, but there were only about 15 or 16 compounds in clinical development. Now, you heard Christian mention the UK. The UK at the same time had 270 companies, but about 175, 180 compounds in clinical development. So you can see the actual tangible results of having something that is funded and something that is commercial. And just one more kind of example of that, Switzerland had about 90, and they had about 90 companies and about 55, 60 compounds in clinical development. So, you know, throwing money at something is not necessarily the solution. I'm talking about how you actually utilize it and apply it. So learn, what Christian said, learn from other people's, you know, errors, shall we say, not mistakes, but errors. You've heard from Christian earlier again about the Me Too research. I loathe Me Too research. As a scientist, you know, why do you want to copy, duplicate something? You want to take it further. There will be crossover, but if you're going to cross over, then find a way to collaborate. Don't try and get grants or money to duplicate and repeat what has been done already. So one of the words that I am very, very keen on is collaboration. You'll hear me say it again. The other one's reality. I actually think the reason that we're in a mess in this biotechnology pharmaceutical industry is because we've tried, each of the stakeholders fundamentally tried to operate on their own. They've all thought they could do it without each other, so venture capitalists thought they could hire pharmaceutical. I'm generalizing and I'm giving a quick view. Pharmaceutical guys thought that they could just, 20 years ago, they thought they could just keep on going down the track as Christian, but, in the way that they were doing, and they would create new drugs. It hasn't worked out like that. What you're seeing now is a far more integrated approach from the industry that is natural. It's not somebody saying, we've got this utopian idea and we're all going to do it for the good of our stakeholders or shareholders. It's a natural progression because it has to happen. It's a natural evolution. Simply, I'm not sure, and we can debate this, big pharma still talk about R&D. They have some very, very talented people working for them. There's no question about that. They're intelligent and they're very talented. But research, no. No, I will categorically say here and now that in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, they're not going to be doing research. It will be outsourced. Now, don't get me wrong in understanding or trying to point out that they have amazing data banks of tools. And this is the important thing. So they can assess very quickly the viability of your research product, your entity, be it a biological or new chemical entity. They can assess whether to take it forward or drop it, right? But the core competency, and this is important, the core competency of big pharma is actually development, clinical trials, marketing, sales, and distribution. And they are recognized. They're not going to come out and say this because they're worried about, about the position. But, so the innovation is now coming out of being recognized out of academia and small institutes, technology transfer organizations, translational research. These are the centers of innovation. So translating this back to what I was saying about Egypt, there is no reason if you allocate your, shall we say, smaller funds considerably as opposed to the NIH or America or Western world. But if you allocate your funds wisely and pertinently, then you can actually develop research to the point of proof of principle where you can actually then collaborate and work with big pharma, because that is what they want. They want to see innovation that is funded to a certain point where they can prove it and ratify it and actually authenticate it in order to take it forward, or decide that they're not going to. So, where am I now? Reality. Yeah, building this whole bedrock and infrastructure and biotechnology, it's a very long, it's going to take you time. It's not something you can just do, as in, I mean, Christian alluded to Quebec, it's a good model. I mean, Australia did it in Victoria, and they had immediate success following those patterns, but then it kind of falls away, or problems materialize. And Christian will comment on Quebec more than I know, but, the initial success and the drive of pouring money in and getting these people back dissipates. It becomes difficult to maintain. So consider how you're going to place the investment and fostering of the innovation that you're doing in context for further down the line. Have some strategic goal. I think yesterday in the CEO panel, I wasn't quite sure what the CEO panel was about, but it seemed to sort of morph into a pharma, a biotech discussion. So I'm not going to spend a long time on this. Timeline for drugs is 13, 15 years. You heard somebody say 1 billion. I think Chris said 1 billion plus is the cost of developing a drug. All these are true as far as we know, although I'd like to see the analyses and the data that actually supports this, because these figures have been bandied around for so long that I think they've become sort of taken as fact rather than actual hard evidence of it, but I do believe that. But the other thing is 10,000 to 1 ratio, we've heard that. But here's the important point for you guys, right? 1 billion, why are you focusing on how much it's going to cost? The real issue is how much it's going to cost you or a research project to develop to the point of proof of principle, where they will take it to preclinical or clinical 1. That's still going to cost you $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. That's a lot of money. This is why you need to allocate your public funding, because these guys are unlikely to provide that funding. That comes out of public funding. So, again, the reality on looking at Europe as opposed to America, and me coming back to infrastructure and how you build a bedrock. I'm very keen on the NIH for one reason, because what tends to happen is that they have an enormous amount of money and they fund research to a point that it has some sort of proof of principle, preclinical data, even phase 1 data, and then it pops up, and then, and this is the collaborative infrastructure that exists in the States. Then, and it's much more stratified, then venture capital gets involved, early stage or angel investors, then big pharma get on. But there are clear kind of overlaps of the core competencies of each of the stakeholders. So Europe is trying to play catch-up, to go back to what it was doing. its success measures are not comparable in those statistics in terms of the number of compounds that are publicly funded, the amount of money that is given to research entities, and they're translatable to the number of products or biologicals or whatever they may be that appear with phase 1 data. In the US, it's far superior. So we need to learn from that, and you need to consider, as an emerging nation or region, what you're trying to achieve. So, you know, and learn from their experiences. So financing, Christian touched on most of this, new models, pharma and VC. 10 years ago, they didn't really work together. They're doing that a lot now, and you may not know this, but there have been big announcements recently of venture capital funds purely for life sciences biotechnology that are being, their limited partners, as Christian alluded to, all their partners, are big pharmaceutical companies, because they have recognized that the core competency of venture capital is the investment and return, the good ones, of capital. That is their job. They frankly don't care, or most venture capitalists, if they are in life science, they don't care what the product is, ultimately. They've got to return to their limited partners. Yes, they work in life science and they care very much about it, but ultimately their key existence is about making money. So, now, to put this in perspective, pharma have corporate venture, they have other vehicles as well, and they weren't very successful with it. You know, I mean, a particular big pharmaceutical company actually set up their own bank, believe it or not, and lost billions because they thought they could do it themselves. So, there are other stories. That's what I'm trying to make. I don't really need to say any more. Pharma's model is changing, as you heard from Christian, and you know, applaudably so. I think they're doing a lot. I think Sanofi are actually doing a lot of good. I think they're recognizing that there is, not just Sanofi actually, Glaxo, all of them are now setting up external centers of excellence, working on kind of DPUs, or discovery program units or whatever. So these are collaborative issues. So again, that word collaboration. So the issue, I think, is one that you have to consider the collaborative issue of all the stakeholders in the industry, and we're seeing that. And that is evolutionary, and it's going to go on in the next 5-10 years, and I predict right now that Big Pharma will be nothing more than ultimately clinical trials, marketing, sales, and distribution, and the use of their existing databases. The innovation will come out of small companies, biotechnology companies, academic institutions that are affiliated as spokes of a wheel. So I will predict that. It's going to happen. Finally, Christian alluded to, just to give you some idea about how hard this whole industry is, and I want to give an overview. You know, the world of private equity venture capital in 2008, about $1.2 trillion was raised. This isn't just healthcare, $1 trillion. This is everything, private equity venture capital. 2 years later, this dropped to about a third of that, 350, 400 billion. Of that, 10% goes into healthcare. Of that 10%, the majority of it went end stage. So not early stage, because they could only get returns, the bigger funds could raise that money, and they were investing in companies that, you know, biotechnology companies well established that had phase 3 data. The gap between early stage innovation and trying to take that forward grew dramatically. So there is a problem there that is now being addressed by Big Pharma's positioning, and indeed venture capitalists are now coming back in that area too. So I won't go on. I've mentioned a lot of this stuff. Really not much more to say. It is a brave new world. I do think that the evolution will continue. I do think that we need to focus on the title of this talk, which was Fostering of Innovation. And, you know, Sanofi's presentation indicates that they are willing to do that. Most of Big Pharma are willing to do it. They are looking now at how they can really fill their pipeline with the innovation out there and use their expertise. Don't get me wrong in what I'm saying. I'm not saying that they don't have really key core skills. They're very talented people. But what they do have is they have a far better idea of what will succeed and what will fail at an earlier stage. So before money is poured in, and I'm speaking to a colleague in, one of our peers, from GlaxoSmithKline, and he said, we're welcome to people coming to us and asking to test the compound to see whether we would take it forward at an early stage. Now, I think that's actually a step in the right direction. I don't know if Sanofi would do that. I think there are IPR issues. But, you know, why would you pour more money after bad if Big Pharma know that it's not going to be valuable to them? Why would you do that? And this is something I think has to change in the industry. So, all I'll say is collaboration, that's the key. I think we've got about 10, 15 minutes, Christian. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Morris. We started a few minutes late, so we'll probably run over by a few minutes and still have lots of time for lunch. I think we've had an interesting discussion with a number of different perspectives. I'd like to start out, and I don't know what answer I'm going to get because I haven't asked Christian. And I think just to keep this easy, I'll go by Christian, and he can be Christian. And that will. Every time Morris said Christian, I didn't know which of us he was going to, until he mentioned what he was referring to, rather than whom. Christian, does Sanofi have any early research collaborations in Egypt or elsewhere in the Middle East, in the region, in terms of drug development or technology development? Can you give us some sort of overview of what you have in place and what you're looking to do?
Sure. So as far as we are concerned, I think that, in between the big organizations that we have in US and in Europe and also in Japan and China, there is a big part of the world in the middle that still is under exploration, I would say. So it is our job to really foster those collaborations. So this is what we are doing. This is also why I'm here, and I'm interested in those countries that I like, and I like to name fast growing. So to make a long story short, we are at the beginning, but yes, we already have some collaborations with Santos in countries. We have mostly for the time being private-to-private collaboration, but we are also discussing some public-to-private collaborations. And to name a few, we have collaborations starting in India, we have collaboration in Russia, we have collaboration in Qatar, we are starting to collaborate in Israel, we have some collaboration in Brazil, we have been exploring Cuba. I mean, many projects. So yes, this is an important focus in the context of what I try to mention.
Thanks, Christian. And maybe a follow-up question, and then we'll shift focus a little bit. Morris mentioned collaboration, which I think is key, and communication and collaboration. If we look back at the way things used to be and didn't work very well for pharma, didn't work very well for VC, I mean, there certainly were some successes, but broadly speaking, the old model used to be researchers or entrepreneurs would come up with a project and get some public funding and take it forward to a certain point, go out and talk to VCs, or the VCs may have even been involved in launching the project in the first place, and they'd fund it right through phase 2 in some cases. And they'd go to pharma and they'd say, we've got this great project. Would you like to buy it or license it or some sort of collaboration? And pharma used to very often take a look at it and say, well, that's very nice, but we're not interested. And it took about a decade for the VC community to do what Morris has been talking about and realize we need to talk to pharma very early on before we start making these huge investments in phase 1 and phase 2 trials. So for research institutes, for different labs here who are working on projects, what do you want to see? I mean, at one point you mentioned, and I think this is key, and it really depends on the therapeutic area, but you mentioned the therapeutic effect, efficacy being the most important, but then mechanism of action being something which gives you a lot more accuracy in being able to predict how something's going to go in phase 3. So what is it that you need to see in terms of and Morris will comment on this after, but I'd like to go first from you. When they come to you with a project, relatively early stage, what are the targets you're going to want to see that are going to be proof of principle for Sanofi?
Yeah. Before replying, I think I would like to correct at least in my view, a few points that have been tackled by both of you, and I have a different view on some of those points. First of all, yeah, this is true that the pool of money to really feed the R&D is declining globally, but it's probably increasing in the same countries and territories I've been mentioning, because yes, those economies are emerging, but those are already very rich economies. And you take, you take the Gulf, you take Qatar, you take Russia, you take Kazakhstan, where we also have some projects ongoing, or you take Brazil, there is some money. And on top of the money, there is, to me, a very important point, which is there is a political strategic vision and willingness to invest in the right projects for many reasons, diversification of the economy and risk dependency, etc. But so all that together makes that probably, the flow of money shifting from the old world, the US and Europe, to those emerging countries. Second point is that I do not believe that the core competencies of pharmaceutical industries are really only in clinical development and clinical trials and sales and marketing. Yes, of course, we are a pharmaceutical company, so we are a profit organization. So yes, we are doing sales and marketing in a responsible way for most of us, at least for all of us at the international level. But I think that the core competencies is really twofold. I think it's in science as well, because we have good science. We are not the only one to have good science, and good science is everywhere. But we have that too. But we have also good, let's say, know-how in coordinating and project management. And project management in the sense of collaboration. So that being said, I think that what we are looking for in any potential, let's say, proposal or discussion is what I've been trying to say. I mean, we need to have sounded science at the basis, meaning we have to have a clear understanding of what we are talking about. So I think that the basic science at the base of the project needs to be strong. It does not need to be advanced necessarily, because indeed we would probably prefer to have early partnership rather than late partnership. But early partnership does not, of course, mean that we are starting just with an idea without any validation. So some proofs of evidence in the mechanism of action, in the size of the therapeutic effect, what we are doing, etc., is really what we are looking for. And yes, as some other colleagues, yes, we are dealing with some agreements to have some transfer and to test on our models some molecules, but the opposite is also true. We often open let's say the database to some others and have cross-check of compounds on targets and compounds, etc.
Thanks, Christian. Coming back to Egypt, and Maurice had mentioned something very important. I'm from Montreal, so I know the Quebec story well, but this Friends of Quebec model, which I think would be a great model for Egypt or any developing bioregion with expats in the sector around the world, worked very, very well. And a number of things they did in Quebec worked very well, but Maurice hit the nail on the head in that they kind of got it set up and had a fair number of startup companies and a number of things going on and said, hey, we're done. And they neglected it for a decade. And then guess what? They kind of have to start over. Not entirely, but they lost a lot of what was done. And they're starting over. They're doing it again. But I'd like to focus on whether it's fundamental research and training, collaborations, whether it's technology transfer, whether it's dialogue with industry. And I don't want to focus just on pharma. We've done that primarily today. But a lot of the ingredients are the same if we're talking about other sectors like agricultural biotechnology, industrial biotechnology, where a country like Egypt could be very strong. And where, frankly, the time to market, well, maybe not after the golden rice example, but in a number of cases, the time to market can be much faster. So you can develop aspects of the bioregion much more quickly. let's go through from each of your perspectives, what are some of the core things, and I'd like, to invite the audience as well, but I want to ask the speakers first, the core things that we should be focusing on, whether in Egypt or in other emerging or developing bioregions. What are some of the opportunities to really focus on core priorities and get it right? Morris, if you had to hit on one thing, what would that be?
Well, and I think actually just thinking about what was said, one of the other things that was said yesterday in the CEO session, there was a mention of, I think he said, and I apologize for focusing on pharma, because Christian's quite right. Biotechnology encompasses a lot of other sectors, agricultural, industrial, etc. That's just mainly my focus. But so yesterday, what I thought was interesting was that this guy next to you, I've forgotten his surname, sorry, but he said that, drugs, it's very hard to do, and it's been 3 countries, well, it's not a country, one of them isn't, but the US, Europe, and Japan have been responsible for the drugs in the world today, biologics or new chemical entities. And, of course, people always put their hands up and say, well, hang on, it was developed here. But it was actually developed, and this is what I'm going to, the expertise of the bigger industry. So my initial thing in regard to Egypt and the development and what you're saying in terms of research projects is that it's very difficult to try and allocate money with a specific reason to investigate a new area or mechanism of action from that top down to bottom. That is where expertise comes. It's very, very hard to do. So I think that, but then you've got the problem of duplicity. So I think one of the things that will happen is that we will see far more analysis of what is wanted in the marketplace, and therefore developing science for something that we can see clearly is required. That will be harder, but I think it will be of more interest to commercial and venture capitalists, to commercial companies and venture capitalists, purely because that is pushing boundaries back in terms of research. And that is what big pharma, big corporations are not going to do. They are not going to go into an area completely willy-nilly and just start investigating purely. They are going to follow on always, so they have to maintain their position, so they will enhance what they have. They may have a eureka moment and discover something. The most famous is, well, there are lots of them, but the most famous that you're all aware of now is Viagra. It's like, that was supposed to be a cardiovascular and heart disease drug. So, that's the eureka moment. But the point is that, I think that we will see a different focusing on what we are capable of doing at an early stage. And I think that will be interesting to these 2 partners, because they will understand that the risk is being taken and they will assess that. Just very quickly, I think one of the things about mechanism of action, etc., we still don't really know the mechanisms of actions of so many drugs that are out there. We don't know. And we don't know their toxicity. Sorry?
About a third of drugs on the market.
Absolutely. Yeah. Right. So, it's a very difficult thing. So the indication, you had a slide up talking about the indication, and mechanism of action is very important, but, I think that it would be admitted going in, the mechanism of action is going to be treated with some sort of lateral judgment or whatever as well. So that's really all I would say.
Christian?
So very briefly, I think that, first of all, it seems obvious that, in order to rightfully use and utilize the public funds, you need to have a clear strategy and a clear definition of your priorities. This is BA, as we say in French, ABC of the stuff. Nevertheless, when you look at the different countries, you very rarely find a strategy, and you very rarely find a set of priorities that make sense for the country in terms of where do we want to put the money. And this is lacking in many, many countries. There are very rare exceptions. There are some exceptions, but it's rare. So to me, I think that this is important first to define this, and second, probably how would I say, perception is that we should try to focus doing so on what really makes sense in terms of public health. So what makes sense locally in terms of public health first before going around and going further local at the regional level or international level. As an example, you know, dengue. Dengue is a medical need. It's a topic to be tackled, and countries where dengue is endemic, like Brazil, for instance, have clearly in their priorities to tackle this, and so that means that everything is put in place in order to foster the collaborations. And as an example, again, we have been collaborating with the authorities and some other related bodies in Brazil in order to develop the vaccines there, as an example.
Thanks. I think that's a very good point. João, you had your hand up.
My name is João Carvalho. I'm from Brazil, and when I was working with in a biotech company, a research biotech company, we had the big problem of maintaining contact with the major pharma. You know, in most countries like Brazil and Egypt, of course, there's no research by pharmaceutical companies. You know, the local pharmaceutical companies, they do follow on at the most. You know, most times they just buy old drugs and put them in the market. And so we had a huge problem of contacting Sanofi even and several others because we didn't, even in Brazil at least, there was not even a research department representative. You know, there was nobody to talk to. We would talk to the commercial guy. The commercial guy didn't know who was running research in the corporate level. And that was a problem. And I think this problem still remains. So you go on in a research, and you find a good drug, and you find you have a proof of concept, and then you cannot contact your prospective client. Mm-hmm. And what do you have to say about that?
Well, a lot of things. First of all, probably your analysis is a little, how would I say? I think perhaps your example is from the past or a few years ago. So we learned also from this lesson, and this is true. What you are saying is true. We have no, as Sanofi, as an example, again, Sanofi is having a lot of development activities in all those countries, including in Egypt, where we conduct pivotal trials to serve the registration, but as in Brazil or in Egypt, we do not have bricks and mortars in terms of research centers. So it was indeed difficult to have this entry door in terms of who to talk to. So we have done two things. One, we structure ourselves in order to have one entry door. So there is today in Brazil, in Sanofi Brazil, a fully dedicated resource for R&D liaison, point one. And second, we went outside again. We went outside and we started to collaborate with, in the case of Brazil, foundation that you know perfectly well, which is BioMinas. And so through local partners and through organizational measures, we are now able really to capture much better. I'm not saying it's perfect. I do not know really what all the others are doing, but as far as we are concerned, we are capturing today a little bit better the opportunities that are there. And this is also true towards the authorities. And this is also true, and this is the way we intend to do it in other parts of the world.
Okay, I think we're going to have to close in a minute, but we have the gentleman here had his hand up.
My name is Islam Noor. I work for Farco International for Pharmaceutical Industries and do my research in Gabriel Institute in Center for Scientific Research. My question is regarding a scientific aspect. You talk about the interacting model for rendering a new drug. I think this model is time-saving and money-saving as well, but isn't the sequential model is more safe than the interacting model in that I can't pass to the next step unless I'm sure that the former step is okay? That's the question.
First of all, I think that your point is very important because, of course, what all I've been saying is certainly not at cost of safety. Safety is key in the whole process, but it's all about what you're working on and what is really your expectations about the therapeutic effect or the credential, the magnitude of effect you are expecting. If you are expecting something that is making a 5% difference, and then okay, your safety needs to be really clean. If you are talking about orphan diseases and you are making a 60% difference on your endpoint, then perhaps you might go a little bit quicker and not compromising safety, but to go a little bit quicker in validating what you have in fundamentals and go to human faster.
Okay, so we're going to have to wrap up in a minute. I'm just going to speak for 1 minute, then I'll ask for final comments from the panel. I think we've had a number of interesting points. Maurice has really focused on the need to allocate funds conscientiously and effectively. And I think there are a number of best practices at the NIH and even at the European Commission in terms of independent expert reviewers selecting the best projects. There are models coming together for collaboration with pharma, which can be built on. I think there's a lot more to discuss here. We didn't talk about plant biotechnology or industrial, but as Mark can tell you, there are many collaborations between industry and between research institutes in Europe and the US and in developing countries. There are things happening now, and there's a lot of potential to develop more. And in fact, the ridiculous situation in Europe may create even more opportunity in developing countries. So there's an advantage you can build on there. I think we looked at a number of best practices focused on getting the best people involved, supporting them, supporting their research training, and really looking at technology transfer and how within a relatively short term to build strong capacities there. We were being told we have to end, then we have another session back here at 1:30, so I hope everyone will be back. But I'd like to ask Maurice and Christian each for a parting piece of advice.
I think perhaps the most important thing is just to reiterate what Christian almost said there. Mark Montague there is who spoke earlier this morning about agricultural biotechnology and innovation. I think yesterday I heard a lady in the audience mention that it's not all about nanotechnology. One of the things I'm trying to get across is that the amount of money required to be spent in life science healthcare is invariably more. So it's not, it's a pertinent allocation of funding that you have, but you need to build, I hate these words, critical mass, but you need to build a bedrock. And if that comes out of agricultural biotechnology or industrial biotechnology or nanotechnology, and then there starts to be crossover of those disciplines with healthcare, life sciences, then that may be a way forward. But what I'm trying to get across, and I apologize for speaking only about pharma biotech, as I say, that is my main area, but it is costly, and it is the highest, to my knowledge still, it has the highest rate of attrition, failure of any industry anywhere in the world. It is the most difficult industry in the world to work in, to create a product and to get that product onto the market. So that's all I'm going to say. I think that it's pertinent allocation of funding and collaborate. And, try and collaborate, because they want to collaborate.
I, of course, fully agree with the collaboration point. Just what I would say is we've been trying for long to improve, and I think we should stop trying to improve and start to change.
That's good advice. I'd like to thank the panel, and I'd like to thank you in the audience. And we have a break now, but I hope to see everybody back here in about 45 minutes. Maybe it will be up to an hour. I assume we'll start a few minutes late, but 45, 50 minutes for the next session. Thank you.